7:30 a.m., July the 1st, 1916, a dark moment in British history. It was the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, which saw the most lives lost by the British Army in one single day. Douglas Haig, the commander during the battle, sent his troops over the top of their trenches, where they charged bravely onto no man's land. It has become a widely criticised move, as people saw it as sending waves of men against the German trenches and into the line of their machine guns. This was his strategy of attrition, which involved wearing down the enemy by continuous attack until they could take no more. As a result of this, on the first day alone, there were 57,470 casualties, of which 19,240 were fatal. 500 of those were under the age of 19. Our casualties not heavy, read one headline. On that same day, over 19,000 British soldiers had lost their lives. Our casualties not heavy. How did the press, or why did the press, get it so wrong? With over 230 newspaper titles in the UK in 1916, by comparison we only really have 96 today, newspapers were read all over the country, with the Times having 150,000 readers and effectively being the window to the war for the public. Regional titles, such as City Telegraphs, did not have the biggest readership, but a lot published articles daily, meaning people anywhere could get regularly updated developments from the front. Yet there was no mention of the bloodshed at the Somme. Most even heralded the day as a major success. Across the UK, from London to Belfast to Aberdeen, both national and local newspapers had sensationalist headlines of glory rather than ones of tragedy. Great British Advance was a very common phrase used, as the Portsmouth Evening News, the Lincolnshire Echo, and the Northampton Chronicle all called it that, amongst many others. Infantry sweep on to pulverised enemy trenches, read the headline of the newspaper The People. The Newcastle Journal boasted splendid results of the advance. With newspapers, sometimes it is what they do not say that matters more than what they do say, given no newspaper gave an honest account of the catastrophic level of casualties that emerged. Even after the officials started to realise the extent of the horror, newspapers tended to remain positive. The Belfast Telegraph, for example, wrote on July the 7th that their death count was probably appreciably less than might have been counted on. An optimistic way of informing the public that there were casualties, but without conceding just how many. If this was to happen today, there would be outrages as fake news for hiding the truth. These, however, were times of war, and there was more going on behind the scenes than simply just poor journalism. On August the 8th, 1914, just 4 days after Britain had entered the war, the government passed the Defence of the Realm Act. It declared that no person shall, by word of mouth or in writing, spread reports likely to cause disaffection or alarm. Essentially, it prevented criticism or open discussion of the war effort. Until January 1916, there was no conscription in Britain, and thus the army relied upon volunteers. Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, wanted 100,000 men to enlist in the army. If a man was to enlist, he had to believe the war was worth fighting, and censorship became a key tool to stifle any news that would have altered that opinion. Journalists felt this censorship the most. Philip Gibbs, writer for the Daily Chronicle, went undercover on the front lines and had to sneak information out of France like a smuggler. For his efforts, he was arrested multiple times before being sent home in 1915, but only after an off-the-record threat of the firing squad. Threatening to execute journalists seems a rather tyrannical form of censorship to us now. This fear of being shot, however, may not have been the sole factor Gibbs eventually submitted to censorship. On the 3rd of July, the Daily Chronicle reported that everything so far has gone well, focusing on the amount of prisoners taken and the villagers relieved of German control, rather than the gut-wrenching amount who were killed. After the war, Gibbs defended his self-censoring, claiming it was done to spare the feelings of men and women who had sons and husbands fighting. Gibbs believed his act of hiding the truth from the public was done in their best interests to protect their morale. The truth will out, as the old saying goes. Whilst newspapers were being delivered door to door with news of victory, telegrams were being delivered with news of tragedy. Telegrams were sent to the next of kin of soldiers that had died in service. They were required to inform them on their relatives of when, where, and how their loved one had died. As a result, July 1916 saw communities shattered across the country. At the beginning of the war, the demand for volunteers led to the creation of so-called PALS battalions, named as such because they were comprised of men who were enlisted at the same time and place. These group of friends also went over the top together, meaning if one battalion suffered heavy losses, people at home could tell by the level of activity of the delivery boy. Despite the lack of press coverage, the public found out one way or another. Our casualties not heavy. For every kilometre of land taken by the British during the Battle of the Somme, they saw 38,000 casualties. 141 days of hell and 456,000 casualties for 12 kilometres. But by November the 18th, it was finally over, and after the battle, the newspapers actually started to report more honestly on the death tolls of the war. In 1917, the War Office started printing its own newspaper, the Weekly Casualty List, which documented all the killed, missing, or wounded. Over a century later, the Somme still served as a grim reminder of the gruesomeness of trench warfare. The newspaper coverage of the first day, or lack of, yet the public still finding out, shows that speech will always try to be free, or at least that it deserves to be.